Welcome to this Mint House event that is linked to the Church's Restorative Practice Network. Really looking to explore the use of restorative practices, restorative approaches in churches. We had a launch event back in November, which I know a lot of you attended, and we were so grateful to have all of you involved in that to really start this work of exploring restorative practice in churches further and really think about practical ways that we can do that. Thank you all as well for all of your feedback that you gave us if you were at that event in November and that you gave us on those evaluation forms. That was really, really helpful to help those of us in the steering group to think about next steps, what would be most useful for you in the future. So thank you so much for that, and we will continue to incorporate those thoughts. There'll be an opportunity at the end of this event to a slightly shorter feedback form, but still to feedback with some of your thoughts on what would be interesting and helpful for you in the future. So please, when you see that link later, do use that, and if you would like to have your say. Also, to keep you updated, that obviously we have this event today, but we are also hoping to hold an online and/or still to be decided in-person reflective practice circle next month to give everyone a chance to have more dialogue with each other on sort of the possibilities and challenges of restorative practice in churches, and to share some of our own experiences and to discuss that with each other in a more sort of discursive format, have a bit more dialogue about that together. So keep an eye out for that. I will keep all of you updated. So if you're not already on our church's restorative practice mailing list, again, please just send me a message or put my email address in the chat and you can join that list. You'll have all the details as soon as all of the details are announced. What else do I need to share? This event today is being recorded because some people couldn't make it today, but you'll only appear on that recording if you decide to contribute by asking a question later, either by video or audio. So if you prefer not to appear on that, obviously feel free to keep your camera off. Otherwise, it's lovely to see all your faces, and you won't appear in that recording unless you interact in that way. And I will send out a recording later this week, as well as with any sort of follow-up information. Michael, who's one of our speakers today, has shared a few presentation slides with me that I'll also circulate. So you'll also get a copy of those later this week. I'm just letting the last few people in as they're arriving. And sorry, there we go. Multitasking here. We're really excited today to host this event, looking at the ways that talking circles, listening circles, and restorative conferences can be used to facilitate dialogue with our conflicts and disagreements in churches. So we're really excited today to have two speakers actually joining us all the way from Australia today, such as the wonders of online events. So we have Michael Wood with us today, who is an Anglican priest in Melbourne, Australia. He's also a restorative facilitator and professional leadership coach. And so he will be kind of introducing this topic for us and talking a little bit about some of the theory and specifics behind some of this work. I'm also really excited that we also have Sue Grimmett with us today. She's also an Anglican priest. She works in Brisbane, Australia, and she's going to share with us some of her own experience of using this in a church setting. I'll sort of interview in a kind of discussive interview format to hear a little bit about the way that that's actually been used in a really practical sense and how that worked with her congregation. So without further ado, Michael, can I hand over to you to share a little bit with us about this topic?
Thank you, Joy. Thank you for inviting Sue and myself. It's great to be here. Hope some of what we share will be useful for conversation starting. I live in Melbourne for the last 4 years after 30 years in Perth and a bit in Melbourne before that. This is the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, so I just want to acknowledge that that's the land on which we meet here in Melbourne, and pay my respects to the traditional custodians of this land. This is a common acknowledgement of country which we do in any public situation where involving workshopping or public gatherings. I'll just flick. I've got about 20 minutes, I think. Is that right, Joy, to set the scene? Very, very quick snapshot. We're not going to try to run you through what restorative practices are because you know it probably know enough about that already, but just to set the scene a little and just share a few little stories from my own experience of using restorative practices in churches. So I started this work about 25, 30 years ago as an Anglican priest in a small, struggling community. Very few people, not much money, um, always trying to figure out how to pay the bills. I was um, trying to lead this little congregation as a young, enthusiastic priest in a way that the only way I knew, which was I'd come out of a business background. So I was trying to lead in that kind of slightly heroic way where I was taking too much responsibility on myself and thinking that it was my job to come up with the answers and, charge out of the um, trenches and have everyone follow me into the battlefield. And it was catastrophically bad news for me and for my communities. And just when I was getting thoroughly depressed and about my own capacity to lead these little congregations, someone referred me to a chap in Melbourne who had been doing some work with circle collaborative work, particularly talking circles and a process called open space technology, which is
Mm.
a process for
Mm.
engaging large
Tell
groups
them to
in
take it down.
self-autonomous.
Sorry, I accidentally muted you, Michael. Please unmute. I was trying to mute somebody else.
That's
Sorry.
it. Clearly, it's going very badly. No,
Sorry.
no, it's okay. So I was getting involved in restorative practices of a type. It's sort of restorative practices is a very big frame, which can involve all kinds of, at the biggest level, all kinds of collaborative type processes, as well as quite specifically defined conferencing processes that have originally come out of criminal justice, but are now increasingly being used in all kinds of other environments. I think the seed of the idea was actually put in my mind a few years earlier by a manager that I worked with. His name was Peter, and I was a young personnel officer. And every time I'd go into his office with a dilemma of some kind about people in the organisation that were fighting with each other, and I'd say to Peter, and Peter would lean back in his chair, put his hands behind his head, and say, "Have they talked to each other about it?" And this was his mantra. He'd just keep saying this. And I thought, oh my gosh, what a simple idea. When people are in conflict, they might actually provide a space where they can talk to each other. So I think that was the seed of the idea. And the sort of initial work I did in circle and collaborative circle processes for collaborative leadership was just the way of expanding that into a more of a structured approach. So that was the key idea. And it's a key principle that underlies all restorative practice, which is aiming to do things with people rather than doing things to them or for them. So what it's doing is it's kind of the language I use was picked up from a short piece by Margaret Wheatley, which I'll drop into the chat box lately, a little short article called Leadership in an Age of Complexity. It's been one of the most influential things I've ever read. And she talks about a shift from heroic leadership, where you try to come up with all the answers yourself, exercise my skill, my character virtues, do things to other people or do things for other people. But how do we shift our way of thinking in leadership towards a more hosting approach where we provide spaces where people can figure out things with each other? Whatever that is, whether it's a complex question or some act of harm or whatever. So how do we move from a heroic mindset to a hosting mindset or doing things with people rather than to them or for them? So that's really the key idea for me that runs through all of this. I'd have to say, as a church leader, it has made my life a lot happier, and I think a lot happier for the congregations as well. Because whenever I have a dilemma and I sit back and think, oh my gosh, what are we going to do about this? My first instinct now is to say, okay, stop trying to figure it out for yourself. It's time to convene a circle, invite people to join us and listen. Let's have a conversation about how we can figure this out together. Right, so there's the key idea. So basically, the sequence in all restorative conferences is this sequence: reflecting on what's happened, who or and who can do something to improve the situation, bring people together through voluntary participation into a structured, facilitated conversation to explore what happened, what can we learn from what's happened, collaboratively generate ideas for how we can improve the situation, and then agree on what is most doable and what's going to have most impact. So that's the basic gist of all restorative practice. It's incredibly elegantly simple, um, but not easy. It actually does take some skill. And so that leads us down the training track. So these are basically three major components for an effective restorative practice in any organisation. So think churches. First of all, embedded in principles and mindsets. Three major principles, which are on the website of the Australian Association for Restorative Justice. Do no further harm. So don't do something that's going to make the situation worse. Work with people. And why are we working with people? We're working with people to set relations right, which happily, from a Christian theological perspective, is the core meaning of justice. So that is very cool. Then you ask the question, well, how do we do that? Through a suite of processes for establishing relationships, maintaining relationships, and resetting relationships if there's been conflict or harm. And then thinking about how we programmatically support and embed that in an organization so that it has long-term sustainability. So they're the three big program components. As I said before, restorative practices are very broad. At the broadest level, if you think about the ethos of doing things with people rather than to them or for them, that can take in a lot of processes. So it can take in coaching, certainly in the way the International Coach Federation defines coaching. Can take in the well-structured conversations, facilitated conversations, types of alternative dispute resolution, talking circles, open space technology, and then particular types of conferencing, which here I've summarized as four different main conference designs. So a restorative conference to address issues of shared concern, restorative group conferences to deal with undisputed harm, restorative group conferences to deal with conflict arising from a series of poorly resolved disputes, and then conferences which deal with institutional betrayal. What I'm going to be focusing on here is the left side, because I'm going to be focusing on this bottom bit of this triangle. How do you use this stuff in the everyday life of congregations? Because some people we need to train to do the pointy end stuff about repairing and resetting relationships. It's challenging work. You need to be skilled at it. You need to be trained at it. You need to be supervised. So not every priest is going to, or lay leader is going to be doing that kind of work. But all of us have a capacity to apply these restorative principles in everyday life of congregations, which is kind of what I was alluding to in my own story of thinking, how can I lead in a way which is effective, but also, frankly, much more enjoyable way of approaching leadership? And so Joy asked me just to share a few examples. So what I've done is just quickly listed down a few, which I'm going to try to rip through in 5 minutes. Joy, just start waving madly at me if I'm running over time, okay? So the green bit, kind of, if you imagine the bottom end of the triangle about conversations for establishing relationships. The yellow section, kind of, things are warming up a bit, maybe there's a bit of tension flying around and we want to kind of head things off at the pass before they get worse. And then there's the pointy end conversations, which are in red in this table. So it's actually this drawing, but I've inverted it just to make it very confusing. So the colors are upside down. So simple example. So I started off doing a basic talking circle process. I think this is a really useful and simple way of just getting started on the track because it's relatively simple to learn and it's very applicable. It can be easily applied in lots of different situations in churches. So we've got a new Archbishop in Melbourne, Archbishop Rick, just come from London a couple of months ago. We've got one of yours. He's come out to the colonies. Anyway, so he's going to do some listening work in parishes in Lent, and he's inviting congregations to listen. So we're going to use a talking process in our parish to address questions that he's asking us to do some listening and discernment around. Really simple example of a talking circle. Um, I have been directly connected myself with using talking circles to enable members of congregations to deal with a couple of very hot referendums we've had in this country in the last 5 to 10 years. One, a recent one, which was on the recognition of Indigenous people, and one on the on same-gender unions, same-gender marriages. Created a lot of conflict in our society, and so we thought, rather than just ignore this, we would use talking circles approach just to listen to members of the congregation, help us to overhear each other, not to decide whether one issue was right or wrong, but to try to embed it in storytelling, which is usually a great place to start when you're dealing with something that's hot. Um, Use talking circles to work with the parish council to identify or the whole congregation actually in our parish. We'd ran a series of talking circles sequenced over a couple of months where we asked a sequence of questions, listening to each other about aspects of our parish life which were life-giving and some which weren't. And then thinking, okay, so what does this mean in terms of where we're going as a congregation? So it was a long form, longitudinal type listening process. I've used listening circles for doing after action reviews. That's a military term, but it's where you might have had a crisis situation and you've dealt with it, but you want to debrief it afterwards, to pastorally support those involved and also to draw out what people have learned and how we might do things similarly or differently in the future. Of the various types of restorative group conferencing processes that are available to us and commonly used, and I'm saying thank you to David Moore and Aliki Vernon, who are in this meeting tonight and who wrote the textbook on it, so I'll just give them a nod. This is a pretty simple process that all parish clergy and lay leaders can be taught. It's not highly complex, but it's very powerful. So I've used that commonly for things like orienting a new parish council, for example, helping people to get to know each other, grow shared understandings on priorities, clarify roles and responsibilities. So we run people through a particular structure of listening, which is called a restorative conference to address an issue of shared concern. The shared concern being who are we, what do we care about, and what are we going to be focusing our efforts on in the next year. Team checkups, really good. I call them, Joy you were just talking about dentists before. Someone said the other day, do you know it's much better to have a scale and clean occasionally than to have a major root canal or a tooth extraction? And I thought, that's great. I'm going to use that. So I'm now going to call these scale and clean workshops or scale and clean conversations, right? Sometimes you just need to get the team in there and just do a little bit of investigation as to what's going on in the relationships. Make sure we're doing well together. Really simple application of this type of conference process would be planning for Christmas events. Really simple, everyday thing. But instead of a small group of people making all the decisions and then doing them to others, what about if we bring anyone who's interested in the congregation together and with each other we determine what Christmas is going to look like? That's great fun. And really you discover all kinds of interesting things you didn't know. So there's a few simple examples of how I've used this in congregations, heaps more. And then the pointy end stuff I'm not going to talk about too much tonight, except to say that's one simple example, which unfortunately can happen from time to time, where you get major breakdowns in relationships, and then you can use restorative conference designs to work that through. And often that's very helpful in those situations to have a skilled external person rather than trying to do it yourself. I'll pause for breath. Back to you, Joy.
Perfectly on time, thank you. And that's really helpful to hear some of the background and just some really practical examples of how this can be used. I see that someone's put in the chat the title of the book that David and Hagi have written. So would
Yeah, and
recommend that if anyone is interested.
sure. And just quickly, there will be a slide in the handouts with some resources specifically based in the UK if you want.
Thank you so much. And I will circulate that later this week in an email to everyone who registered for today. So don't worry about panicking now that the screen is gone. I'll send that around later this week via email. Um, so I'd love to hear a little bit more about the specifics of how some of this can work. So Suzanne, are you happy to share just a little bit about how you first encountered using restorative circles or restorative approaches in your work?
Sure, love to. My history of restorative work actually went back to working in schools, which a school that back in that day it was seen more as a behaviour management approach, and it was about the whole school becoming a restorative school. What was when I reflect back on it now, I think it's amazing that it was a church school and that we didn't ever make the translation. Here we are doing things, saying things like, "Oh, these students are amazing at coming up with solutions," when we actually put the problem back to the group, and yet we never said, "Why don't we try that ourselves?" And so when I some years later I ended up at St John's Cathedral, it was a first of all, kind of this paradigm shift of actually beginning, as Michael was talking about, it's the opposite of the heroic leadership model. That was beginning with that sense of not only are we individually, we can only know ourselves relationally, we also can only have a sense of who we are as a community and where we're going relationally, and that the real magic happens in the spaces between. And it was that kind of paradigm shift that first of all was different. And then, of course, they were using processes like open space, like talking circles. And, I began to operate. I'd used some of that in schools, but suddenly using it well, that was in the cathedral setting, but in a parish setting. Um, yeah, so it opened up the world of possibilities of seeing how communities can really evolve. We also used it in Synod. That was still while I was at the cathedral. We had the first, I think, open space at Synod, and discussing, so getting all of the Synod reps involved in open space approach, and having talking circles happened at another synod where we took a key question and everyone, and interesting, the feedback from that was so much how it was the best part of synod. It was the moment when people remembered, they said they actually got to have a voice and they got to share some of it was some of their response to things that were going on, and inevitably were worked into it, but it meant that synod suddenly felt more collaborative and people had voices who didn't normally have voices. Um, so that was kind of the background before I then landed in here at Indooroopilly, where I am, and we began on the back. Interesting, Michael mentioned the two big referendums, the marriage plebiscite and the voice much later when I'd been here for a while. But that's a big event in the nation, but it also, of course, intersects everyone's lives, and it intersects in ways that we may not know unless we take time to stop and talk about it. So they were the sort of things that we started to address, particularly, I'd arrived here not that long after the marriage plebiscite, and that was the one that came up first.
Yeah. So are there other sort of disagreements or conflicts that you've been able to navigate using these types of approaches? Could you maybe share a couple examples of the types of things that you think it was particularly effective for, or maybe not effective for?
Mm. Yeah, yeah, sure. I mean, we certainly use that parish council as a way of orienting a council, and having talking circles that help us to set us. We had one last year that we actually used for the whole parish, that we started off saying, well, similar to the one that Michael was talking about. It's a bit in the scale and clean category of checking in regularly, and how are we traveling as a community of faith? And that was interesting because we came to the point of saying, well, what is a community of faith? And that was a question that then we were able to clarify so that we all knew we were talking about the same things. Then we moved to, what's most important in this space right now in this time, and it's actually something, because that one wasn't just talking circles. We used some approaches with some record keeping, and so we're revisiting that now at the start of this year to say that was then, where are we now? So it's that scale and clean stuff. The marriage plebiscite one was interesting in terms of conflict, I guess. The Where we were as a community is that people wanted to put the rainbow flag up on the website. We had broadly everyone agreed that they wanted to be very welcoming and affirming, so that wasn't so much the issue. The more of the issue was we're not sure we're comfortable talking about it. And I didn't feel that we should be putting anything up anywhere without a sense that this is something that the parish agrees with, that we as a community can say we are comfortable doing this, and this is something we want to do. That's for two reasons. One is to say, are we owning this? And secondly, to say, is this actually making it a safe place for LGBTIQ people, or is it just the leader doing this? What was fascinating about that was a series of talking circles over a few months. We moved really slowly, and I think the more sensitive the issue, the more slowly you move. But the things that came out of that were quite surprising, partly because there's always things that emerge from talking circles that, that you would never have thought would emerge and that you didn't know were going on in your community. And my favourite story from that one is one of our elderly members who said for the first time she was able to talk. She had a forum where she could talk to her friends who she'd known for decades about her son and his partner, of whom she was very proud. And she said, it's the first time I felt it was okay to talk. And that was something unexpected that came up. One thing I did notice, though, after we'd started convening, and with the voice, convening circles around difficult or sensitive issues, and I hadn't noticed that we'd stopped convening circles about the everyday issues. And so suddenly a circle became a loaded thing. So that was something for me to watch, to go, let's make sure that we're still convening these circles, that this is part of our everyday practice. And so that was when we returned to the question about how are we travelling as a community of faith? Because for this to become just our regular way of being, and a natural way of just, other people saying, let's convene a circle, meant that it took away some of the alarm around it too. Yes, the everyday thing.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, one I'd
Mm.
not thought of either. So I think
Mm.
that's, yeah, really helpful to think about. I'm aware that some people here today will be very familiar with restorative practices. Some people who are even, experienced facilitators themselves, but there are also probably people here today who are very new to restorative practice, to restorative approaches. Could you just explain a little bit about sort of the practicality of what a talking circle or a listening circle means? Like, how does it work? Like, what do you actually do to facilitate that? What does it look like in sort of a really practical sense of, how the room looks or how many people are there or how it operates? Could you just kind of give us a bit of an overview of how that operates?
Sure. I mean, Michael's probably the best one. Others here to do that, and many of you have convened those circles before. I mean, for a simple circle just around an organising question, the ones that we might do, the check-ins after a church service, where someone will come up and have a question of concern. We simply use a talking piece, and we go around the circle and ask for initial responses after a check-in. And sometimes it's that spiral down to another presenting question that comes from what is emerging. I did think it's important, like that basic practice is very simple, and at the end, making sure we have a round to check in and see how people are feeling, what their responses are to the whole circle. But I think what was important that I have, when we were doing it a fair bit, I did get a bit sloppy, and I forgot to, say, oh, don't,
Mm.
talk across, and those simple things became important. So that was a lesson to me, to go make sure just the basic guidelines are there. That's a very simple talking process, but I think the important thing for me that I've discovered is that there are an array of processes that are collaborative. And the one that I mentioned before about how we're traveling as a community of faith, we kind of made up on the go because we wanted to make sure that those elderly members of our community were included as well. And we knew that they wouldn't go across to a separate circle where we had a circle of chairs. And so we actually used the morning tea tables. We did give plenty of foreknotice that we were going to be doing something different. And we had the question there, and we did introduce it, but we had someone who was just who at each table who was prepared to take some notes. So it was kind of a variation on some other things that I just adapted to what our particular setting was, where I knew we're sitting around tables. It was a way um, of having what is a natural way that our community organises. Okay, so I guess not being hard and fast about some of these rules has been important for us in order to embed it as a natural process. I guess and also the making sure that there's any process that helps people all to have a voice, that people, instead of the strongest, most dominant speaker speaking all the time, that enables that, also enables the freedom that you can pass. The law of 2 feet. You can go whenever you want to go, get up and leave. When it's over, it's over. There's not a set time. We're going to talk here for the next 45 minutes, and then, it's not like that. So I think having some few principles has helped me, but I'm sure there's others in this room who would be able to talk better about the specifics.
Mm. Yeah, and that kind of leads me on to a question I was already thinking of wanting to ask about how do you sort of prepare or introduce the congregation to this concept? Do you kind of talk about what it would involve, or do you invite people to a specific, you said there's different forms it's taken on, inviting people to a separate space or kind of incorporating it already into an existing sort of time that you have together? How do
Yeah.
you introduce this work to people in the
Yeah.
congregation, invite them to take
I,
part?
I do think it is powerful to incorporate what the natural lines,
Mm.
where is the natural spaces of gathering. And I have sometimes, we've done both and though. We've had specific times, the talking circles after the marriage plebiscite were at a specific time in a different place. They were much more formal. Um, we, I think the introduction, there is a place for teaching. I think teaching can catalyze some other enthusiasm and some interest, as well as some understanding of where we're coming from. And theologically, teaching is important too. So I have done quite a bit of work talking about kenosis, that idea of a God who makes space for us, which I know Michael in his book Practicing Peace uses, has a lovely section on. Our congregation is also going to be studying Michael's book this Lent and many around the Brisbane diocese. Again, that teaching part having a place with this, teaching people about that idea that if, it's actually it's not a fad, it's not a new program, it's not a buckle on. So often churches have run on either the hero leader or the next new program. This is actually core to our theology, who we are, and teaching and helping people to understand that it's core to who we are is has been critical, I think. And exploring some of the things like Michael has explored tonight, just around the way we see leadership, how we connect as communities. So both a small teaching component, but then constant revisiting, constant moving back into collaborative spaces, I think is where we all learn. And for me, it's definitely been a fail forward thing. You learn, go, oh, that didn't work. Why was that? And you learn more about yourself, and the community learns about itself as you fail forward.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Mm.
Um, we have a lot of time now to sort of open the floor for other questions, both to present to both Michael and to Sue. But first of all, Michael, is there any, don't want to put you on the spot, but are there any other things that you'd like to sort of add on to anything that Sue shared, or anything else that you think might be helpful to drop into the conversation today?
Uh, no, not at this stage. I think I'll just trust the questions. Well, we could model doing things with people rather than to them. That'd be cool.
Yeah. Yeah, great. So if anyone does have a question, feel free to put it in the chat, or if you'd like to, it's lovely to see people's faces as well. So if you feel able and brave to ask a question over a video as well, then that's lovely to have that dialogue with you as well. So if you'd like to ask a question sort of verbally, feel free to use the little raise hand button on Zoom, or like I said, put something in the chat, and we'll try to have some discussion together. Mary.
So my context is Baptist, and we have our Baptist church meetings. And I experienced introducing things like listening circles into meetings and other contexts. What is your experience, and how do you approach when there's a resistance to a new method? You've already talked about explaining and teaching, giving the theology and so on. I'm just interested if you've any stories of that, because people, perhaps more in the UK, I don't know, have been very used to a business type meeting, and introducing restorative circles is something again.
Hmm.
You reflect on that, please.
I do have a story about that because I do, and I agree. I think, Mary, I've had that experience that even the practice itself raises quite a big reaction, because it's a whole paradigm shift. But when I first came to my parish, they set up for the first parish council, and they had a big desk up the front, and then they had rows of chairs in front, like actual rows, and they pointed to the big desk up the front, and they said, "You sit there." And I was like, what? No, of course, I'd come from doing all this beautiful collaborative work at the cathedral. And I must, as much as we do with and we go slowly, I couldn't do a meeting sitting at a big desk with people in rows. So even addressing the space, that's a good, I know my OT friends, are incredibly good resources for learning how to change the environment and how that affects things. So setting up the furniture differently was a really important point, and that was kind of enough for the first. I still ended up, like I tried to hand over the facilitation of parish council far too soon. That was one of my early learnings. Yeah, that didn't work. But just moving the furniture, and then like sticking with the old plan of me running all the meetings, and in quite a top down kind of approach that they were used to using. We had to stay with that for a while, but starting with the furniture, starting with the spaces can be, that can often speak louder than many things.
Thank you.
Yeah, Michael, did you want to say something as well? And then Myra, I think, wanted to say something as well.
Thanks for the question, Mary. It's really important. I remember running a talking circle workshop uh, in a, I won't say where, about 10 years ago. And then we had we built in some follow-up conversations afterwards. So people would go away, try something, and then come back and we'd debrief it. And one of the participants came back and said, yes, I went to the Mothers Union meeting, and I went in there and I said, today we're going to do a talking circle. And I thought, oh my gosh, I am such a bad workshop facilitator. Like, how did that message not get across? So it's really, really important, I think, with this work to really stick to the voluntary participation thing early on. And so start to introduce, don't go and just try to land this onto an existing meeting. People will kick back because they've got a system they're used to. Create opportunities to engage in a particularly interesting conversation that people are interested in, and host it and say, this is happening. I'm inviting you to come on Sunday morning, but after church, after morning tea between 11 and 12:30, this is the question we'll be reflecting on. We'll be using a circle process. This is what it will look like. Please come if you like. And so creating lots of little experiences where people can come in safely, knowing what they're coming into and experiencing something. I don't know if that addresses what you were saying or not, but I think that's an approach for getting change.
That's helpful. Myra, did you want to chip in with something?
Thank you, and thanks both to Michael and Sue for your stories. As I was listening to you, I was trying to think of some of the experiences that I've had in the last few years in this area. And I think, Michael, what you said at the beginning about a mindset shift is probably in my thoughts at the moment so core, because one of the issues that I have faced is that if you go into a situation and you've got your kind of formula, talking circle or whatever, with its set questions, it doesn't necessarily fit the context. For example, in a church where I was involved, it wasn't one incident, it wasn't one issue, it was a whole culture crisis. And it's how you enter into a sort of massive culture crisis within a group of people. There was not just what Mary described earlier as resistance, there was a kind of passive aggression, which just felt so endemic that you kind of wondered, where do you start? If you ask them the question, what happened? Or what does it feel like? There were too many things to talk about, and it was just a minefield. So, and when you asked, how did you feel? People were not in touch with their feelings, or they were too afraid to express their feelings because the culture was so critical. So one of the things that came through for me was that the process is not just an exercise or a practice. It is a very long process. And how to prepare people for the long haul, I think, was for me a big issue. And I don't think they were at that stage ready for the long haul. They were looking for a quick fix. And it was just too complex and too deep for it to be sorted in one go. And then the other thing that came across when I was listening to you, Sue, especially, when you started to use the language of faith, I'm always challenged by, so what is distinctive? Why would we bring this into a church setting? What is it about? Where does lament, conversion, transformation, how does that actually land? So sorry, they're quite big questions, but for me, these were the struggles. One was, if the problem is complex, how do you unravel it and take it into the long haul? And if you're wanting to make it distinctive in the context of church, how do you articulate that? It not in a high level literary fashion, but in a very down to earth, day-to-day faith expression. How do we do that? Sorry for the questions, but your stories provoked that for me, as well as my own past experience.
Thanks, Myra. I don't know if Michael or Sue, you want to come back with any discussion points on that.
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and it's a big one. So, and it's hard to kind of address in the except in relation to the specifics of a particular thing. Obviously, highly complex questions require a lot more preparation and design of process. So so thinking about that preparation phase is really important. We don't just kind of sit down in a circle and get to work, on a highly complex question. It's there's got to be a lot of preparation work. I think that's all I could say at that stage in relation to your question. So it's a process design question. I'm sorry I can't be a lot more help on that. It's the very nature of complexity that it's not going to yield itself to a simple one-off kind of meeting. And the design of the way the meeting is structured is really important. So if there's a lot of emotional load due to past history or experiences or whatever, then we've got to think about how we're going to process that emotional load before we can get on to thinking about issues or even actions, because Dave and Leakey talk about this in their book around affect theory, is that distress trumps interest. So unless you have a process for dealing with distress, through a structured mechanism, we can't get to collaborative decision making. We've got to deal with the distress first, and that's often, depending on the size of the group, you might be able to do that in a talking circle, but it may be a lot better to have a design such as David and Leakey talk about in their book, of a really systematic storytelling, sequencing people through a series of events about how we got here, so that we can develop shared group understanding, shared sense making about all these different things have somehow brought us to this point. So moving it from just a mess to a kind of, in people's imaginations, a sequenced series of events that have got us from where we were to where we are now. That structured process can be very useful as part of the design and training facilitators to do that work.
Mm.
Thank you. That's helpful. I think if I take what you're saying, I think maybe what was important was this wasn't just like two people having a conversation or a conflict. This is where everybody has their own story, and as you've said, one has to work back from the individual stories and the getting through the emotional stage before you can really start to talk more strategically and practically. Thank you, Michael.
Sue, did you want to chip in?
Yeah, I'll try and keep it brief, but I think it really points one thing that we've been talking a lot about lately in Brisbane is just how important having longevity in leadership for this stuff is. Because when you have a cultural, a systemic or cultural issues that are so complex, they only are going to shift over time and with intention too. But you've got to build trust. And because distress does trump interest, then where you have to have people feeling safe that you can hold their distress and that you can be with and walk alongside. So that kind of, cultural change is going to be slow, and it does grow from relationships that are genuine and built over time. So that's one thing there. Your other question about the theology of it and how to say it, I think one way I've sort of reverted to saying in short film is that hierarchies are inherently violent. That whenever power is used hierarchically, we end up with rivalries, and Jesus calls out our rivalries. And so often we start theologically talking about hierarchy and power and Christ laying down of power. And that's the short answer to what I wrote many thousands of words on.
Right. Joe's had a hand up for a while. Joe.
Hi. Thank you, Michael and Sue. Thank you. It's been really, really good. In many ways, one of the things that I was going to say was slightly in response to Myra, but yeah, absolutely agree. I think for me, as I work in restorative ways with churches, it's definitely easier me going in to use talking circles as part of the process. I find it far harder to use that in my context of my own church, where people have a particular view of me, so sometimes it is very definitely. I would echo that sense of building the trust, particularly. But both within your own kind of congregation, own setting, that you're not just parachuting something in. Oh, we're doing it differently this week. But we're working in those complex state situations. You have to go really carefully when the emotions are so raw and so deep, because the ears are plugged. The question I particularly wanted to ask was, one of the things that I find in helping people to do talking circles is, how do you what advice would you give in setting the question for the discussion, for the talking circle? How we can put that question in a way that's not closed, but enables people to participate at the point that they are at, and doesn't actually compound the situation or the conflict by pushing a one view. So I know I have my ways, but I'd be really interested to know what ways you have for setting those questions.
Yeah, I think it's really important the way the question is framed. Someone else raised a question about, do you just sit in a circle and people start raising questions? I don't think so. No, I wouldn't advocate that. It's so a meeting, any kind of circle is always structured around an intention, a group of people that has realized that we need to do things together because we can't do them apart. Um, um, so it's a collaboration, is co-laboring, working together. So is it a genuine question? That's the thing. So not I'm going to come in here and try to convince you I'm right. This is a co-laboring process around a question we don't know the answer to, or an interest that we have that we can only resolve together. So that would be one thing. And then generally, my experience is that often people will go into structuring conversations around a problem. So how do we fix the problem? To know why that's not a good idea, read David Cooperwriter's stuff on appreciative inquiry. If you haven't already, just Wikipedia David Cooperwriter, appreciative inquiry, where he makes the point that systems move in the direction of the questions we ask. And he tells a story about how he came up with his theory as an organizational consultant. But if you raise a question about fixing a problem, first of all, you're working out of the logic of that created the problem in the first place, which is never a good idea. Secondly, you risk putting people into a depressive spiral. And thirdly, you risk making the problem worse because you're asking a problem-centered question where everyone fixates on the problem. So wherever we have a problem, what we're actually wanting to do is spin it round to what are we actually trying to achieve here? What's our aspiration? What's our interest? What kind of preferred future are we trying to create? The reason it's a problem is that something is getting in the way of an aspiration, but we may not have articulated it yet. So frame the question around positively worded, future-oriented questions. Where are we trying to get to? Then you can talk about, well, where have we come from and what are the emerging issues? And the emerging issues are always in the context of what we're trying to achieve. So I don't know if that helps, Joanna, but that's.
Yeah, thank you so much. It is that temptation to go straight for almost for the jugular if there is a presenting issue sometime in people's, that's what they feel that they're there for. And so to, in a way, create a framework where that they can explore the bigger picture or the intention behind it is so important. And but yet quite hard to do when people think they're coming to a meeting or a talking circle for a particular reason to make a particular point. And so I feel that the way that it's framed is so important. So thank you for that. That's really helpful.
Yes, and it's really important people know what they're coming to.
Yeah.
We don't have a lot of time left. I think there's been a few more questions in the chat that we haven't had a chance to get to, but I think there's also been a few responses as well in the chat. So definitely have a look at some of those. Just want to say briefly, there was one question in the chat about sort of very briefly, what is a listening or talking circles model? Just to say the most basic principle behind it, I say this as a non-expert, but from my understanding of it would be, you want people to sit in a circle. And you would have, I think you've heard people refer today about a talking piece. So that could be like a ball or like a little statue or any sort of small item that someone can hold, a stone maybe. And then people pass it around the circle. And then when you're holding that talking piece, then it is your turn to speak. And as we've said, there's lots of different formats of ways that you can formulate those questions, sort of how you want to structure that, whether you want it to be a little bit more free-flowing or very structured and regimented. But that's a sort of basic format and the idea. Then you would go all the way around the circle, and then everyone has a chance to speak when they're holding that talking piece. If people don't want to say anything, they just want to listen, they can just pass that piece on to the next person. And depending on the format, you might have several rounds of different questions. But as we've said today, there's lots of different formats and ways that you can do this that different people use. But that's for those of you who are kind of new to restorative approaches. And when we talk about circles, that's kind of the most basic way that we tend to talk about it. Michael.
Yeah, and just to clarify, we've been talking a lot about talking circles tonight, which is a very useful way, in my experience, to get started because of its simplicity. But as you've just said, Joy, there are a range of processes which don't rely on a talking piece at all. They're much more structured with a facilitator moving a group of people through a sequence series of questions. And that's a very sensible thing to do when you need to get that story laid out that I was mentioning before.
Yeah.
You don't want the group just going wherever it wants to go because you're trying to, so it really depends. The design has to follow the intention of the meeting. Talking circles are great if you just want to get a quick a reading on where people are at generically around a particular question, develop deepen relationships, kind of train people not to interrupt each other. Fantastic. But when you move into higher level conflicts where you've got history that you have to deal with, using a structured and sequenced process is I guess the learning that I've picked up. I started in talking circle work and then moved into more structured restorative conferencing where yes, it's much more carefully planned and sequenced and driven by a facilitator.
Yeah, definitely. And as we said, we don't have a lot of time today to kind of go in depth into that. And as Michael said at the beginning of this session as well, that takes a lot of training, a lot of skill. It's kind of multiple day training courses to really be trained up properly to do that as a facilitator, because it's very important to not go into it ill prepared and then make everything worse, to be quite frank. We have like 1 minute left for a quick question. Emily, I've seen you've raised your hand.
Yes, thank you. I'm just interested, is there a book, Michael, that you would recommend as background reading on this more complex program and process?
Yes, there's a number of useful starting points. There's I'm just going to copy this into a chat.
Okay.
In terms of just basic circle work, there's this is very old actually, but I think it's still like quite robust for just really simple work in parishes. So Kay Prentice's A Little Book of Circle Processes, Christina Baldwin's A Leader in Every Chair. Like they're kind of just really nice introductions to the work.
Yeah.
But if you want to move into the more high-level restorative conferencing work,
Yes.
then that's you Google that. But David and Aleki's book is just hot off the press from last year from Routledge is kind of really the gold standard, I think. And I'm not just saying that because they're buddies of mine, but I've just learned so much from that. And that'll be in the PDFs that Joy will send around.
Right. Excellent. Thank you, Michael.
And if you're also interested in their work, we actually did an event with them last year, possibly the year before, on that book as well. So if you go on our website, you can obviously it's a very brief overview of some of the things they cover in that book. There's so much in that book. If you want a little taster of the kind of things that they talk about, you can go and also watch that event on our website. I'm pretty sure it's up on our website. We are really running out of time now, which I think, as always happens, I'm sure we could keep talking about this for quite a long time. But it's been so great to have you here, and sorry for those of you whose questions we didn't get to. I'll try to collate all of those resources that have been shared in the chat into that follow-up email when I send it later this week, so we all have that in one place. As I said at the beginning, we really love your feedback, so I'm just putting a link in the chat for the evaluation form. If you could click on that so it opens up in your browser so you don't lose it when we close the call. I'd really appreciate your feedback to hear what was useful about today, but also what you'd really like us to do more events on, or what would be useful for you in terms of training or support in the future. We have other events coming up. As I said, hopefully next month, a chance to have a bit more of a personal discussion about some of these things through some reflective practice, circles and discussion. So if you have a look on our website and also sign up for our mailing list, then it means that you'll hear when I get all those details arranged. Yes, so like I said, we hope to hear from you and continue to connect with you with the ongoing Church's Restorative Practice Network and continue to really grapple with some of these issues and also give support to those of you who want more training and want more support and really are trying to find ways to incorporate this into your churches and to your ministry and the work that you're doing. So thank you again so much to Michael and to Sue for joining us. We're really grateful for your expertise and sharing your time with us today. And yeah, we hope to see you all soon. Thank you so much.